Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. I'm surprised I have to say this out loud, but I have autism, and yet I'm not a psychopath. Which is, of course, precisely what a good psychopath would say. So now, just by virtue of having brought it up at all, I've got to construct an argument to prove that I'm not a psychopath. And so today, we're going to look closely at what makes a psychopath and how closely those traits align with the autism spectrum. Well, recently I did an episode on how my brain works, mostly in terms of misunderstandings and mind blindness, and it generated a lot of interesting feedback in the comments. The one thing that stood out the most, however, questioned what the difference was between the autism I was describing and being a psychopath. I was surprised somebody would even ask, but it seemed too important to just leave a comment behind on it, and so here we are. Psychopaths are usually characterized by traits such as a lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and risk-taking. While these traits can be harmful in many contexts, in certain professions they give an individual a competitive advantage. Psychopaths are well known to succeed in roles such as surgeon, CEO, lawyer, media personality, and even in sales. Let's take a quick look at one classic example, the surgeon from Malice. See if you can spot the grandiose sense of self-worth that he's trying so hard to conceal.
I have an MD from Harvard. I am board certified in cardiothoracic medicine and trauma surgery. I have been awarded citations from 7 different medical boards in New England, and I am never, ever sick at sea. Now, you go ahead and read your Bible, Dennis, and you go to your church, and with any luck, you might win the annual raffle. But if you're looking for God, he was in operating room number 2 on November 17th, and he doesn't like to be second-guessed. You ask me if I have a God complex? Let me tell you something. I am God.
Now, if I'm going to be giving you important information, you might rightly wonder where I'm getting my information. And the answer is largely from a book called Without Conscience by Dr. Robert Hare. It's not a textbook per se, but it's common as a supplement in college psych and criminal justice classes. The book is famous mostly for Dr. Hare's inclusion of his PCL-R test, the psychopathy checklist revised. It breaks down 20 main criteria into 2 main sections. One section identifies lifestyle and behavioral traits, while the other considers interpersonal and emotional traits. Let's take a look at each of these points and see how well, if at all, they align with the characteristic traits of autism. Let's start with behavior. At the top of the list is a perpetual need for stimulation. And as you can plainly see from my sedate surroundings, I clearly prefer beige walls and no distractions. So yeah. Okay, I'll give you this one. I do like a lot of stimulation, but I don't know if my ADHD is part of my autism or something separate, since it's all in the same head. But guilty is charged either way. People with autism often even self-stimulate when they're faced with stress, change, or novelty, which can range from rocking in their chair, as you've no doubt seen me do from time to time here, to snapping their fingers or bouncing their knees. Next up is a parasitic lifestyle. Psychopaths don't like to earn their own way. They'd rather find a way to exploit you and have you earn their way for them.
Biomai is owned by Inez Munoz and trained by Lois Petit.
Now, I've been the sole breadwinner for 6 people for like 20 years, so I think I'm in the clear here. And I don't see it as an autistic trait in general. Everybody I know that's on the spectrum that's able to work does so. Sure, there are going to be folks for whom their autism is so profound that they require full-time care, but that's something different, as it's not exploitive. So no check mark here. In the context of psychopathy, poor behavioral controls refers to an individual's inability to regulate or restrain their impulses and emotions, particularly anger and frustration. Psychopaths often have sudden outbursts of aggression, irritability, or inappropriate reactions that are disproportionate to the situation.
You fucking liar! You let me fucking sit there!
Please sit down.
How the fuck am I supposed to trust you? You're my doctor.
Please sit down. You're scaring me.
Despite being aware of the potential consequences, they struggle to curb impulsive actions, contributing to reckless or violent behavior. So I think I'm actually going to have to concede this one, but I'm not saying that people with autism act out in the same manner as psychopaths, but they certainly do have trouble with emotional regulation, irritability, frustration, and outbursts. The reasons behind them might be entirely different, but as a symptom, this is still a checkbox that we've got to check. And the same is true of early behavioral problems. Again, I think the reasons are very different between the two. For little kids with autism, they may not get how to play with other kids, how to share, how to stand in line, or take a nap on a towel. Their immature or underdeveloped social skills may be labeled as behavioral problems. In contrast, the psychopath's sins as a child tend more towards aggression, lying, deceit, rule-breaking, conduct disorder, and so on. You know, the fast-talking badass kid from grade 2 that kicked everybody's butt and wound up in prison by 22? Yeah, probably that guy. Speaking of which, the next two items are juvenile delinquency and criminal versatility. I'd argue that the nerds from the band and computer science classes aren't the first kids you think of when you hear juvenile delinquent, nor are they generally considered to be criminal masterminds. But those kids you're imagining in your head are often on the spectrum, so I'm going to call these 2 points busted, as it were. Next up is a lack of realistic long-term goals, and I think this one is firmly reserved for the psychopaths. I've only worked with one person that I was pretty sure was a real-deal psychopath, and every year they would regale me with stories of how they were going to be a fighter pilot or ski instructor 6 months from now. Except every few months the grandiose plans would change and he'd be no closer to any of them. As my brother likes to say, these guys are always planning to build a helicopter in their backyard. Contrast this with people on the spectrum who crave structure, predictability, and lack of change. Their plans are usually more concrete, incremental, detailed, and realistic. The next trait is irresponsibility. People on the autism spectrum generally do not share the irresponsibility trait in the same way that psychopaths do. However, there may be occasional behaviors that can be misinterpreted as irresponsibility, but they stem from different underlying causes. For example, some individuals with autism, like me, might struggle with executive functioning, which can make tasks like planning, organizing, remembering, and meeting deadlines difficult. This is not due to a lack of care or disregard for responsibility, but rather a challenge with certain cognitive processes. People with autism often value rules and structure, and many have a strong moral compass. When they fall short in a task, it's most likely due to difficulty understanding expectations, navigating social nuances, or managing stress, rather than a willful evasion of responsibility. In contrast to the manipulative irresponsibility seen in psychopathy, people with autism may actually feel more pressure and anxiety over their perceived failures or mistakes. So while some behaviors might look similar on the surface, the root causes are fundamentally different. People on the spectrum are not typically irresponsible. If I miss a meeting with somebody without giving notice, it's because my executive functioning sucks and I completely spaced it. If a psychopath misses a meeting, it's probably because they didn't care about inconveniencing you and they never gave it a second thought. And finally, in the behavior category, there's a failure to accept responsibility. In the context of psychopathy, this refers to the consistent refusal to acknowledge one's mistakes, wrongdoings, or the consequences of your harmful actions. The psychopaths often rationalize or deny their behavior, blame others, or minimize the severity of their actions, showing a lack of remorse or accountability. In contrast, individuals on the spectrum do not generally exhibit this behavior. While people with autism might struggle with social cues, communication, or understanding other people's perspectives, there's no general trend towards deliberately denying responsibility or acting manipulative. If somebody with autism appears to avoid responsibility, it may often be due to difficulties in understanding the social context, not a lack of empathy or an intent to deceive. The emotional detachment and lack of moral accountability seen in psychopathy are absent in autism. Thus, the failure to accept responsibility in psychopathy is driven by manipulation and a lack of guilt, while any similar behavior in autism stems more from challenges in processing social information and not malicious intent. And thus, I'm going to consider them different enough that we can't grant this one. Next up is pathological lying. People on the spectrum aren't necessarily any more honest than neurotypical people, but by and large, they suck at lying and deception. Effective deception requires a strong theory of mind so that you can think on behalf of the other person and then spot the weaknesses or tells in your scheme. And it's something that people with autism just can't do well even when they try.
You're asking me to keep a secret?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, but you would have had to express that desire before revealing the secret, so that I could choose whether or not I wanted to accept the covenant of secret keeping. You can't impose a secret on an ex post facto basis.
What?
Secret keeping is a complicated endeavor. One has to be concerned not only about what one says, but about facial expressions, autonomic reflexes. When I try to deceive, I myself have more nervous tics than a Lyme disease research facility.
And so, psychopaths and people with autism are very different in their capacity for deception. Manipulative behavior comes up next. Generally, manipulating somebody requires a fairly good theory of mind to help the manipulator predict, understand, and prepare for the thoughts of their target. Tom Sawyer talked the other kids into doing his fence painting chores by appealing to them in a way that he knew each of them would react to. Doing so effectively is an ability that is compromised in many people on the spectrum because they are unable to accurately predict what the other person's mental reaction to their own theory of mind will be. And yet I was tempted to almost grant this one, not because I think that people on the spectrum are any more manipulative than average. But if every time you want chicken nuggets you have a meltdown unless they're in the shape of a dinosaur, two things might be true. One, the shape is likely disproportionately important to you, and two, you'll likely start getting your way eventually just to make everybody's life a little easier. Whether that just makes you high maintenance or manipulative is hard to say, and it probably depends on whether you're 30 or not. Intent matters, and the mechanisms here are different enough between psychopathy and autism that this one also does not get a check. The next list brings us to a lack of remorse or guilt. Now, I was raised Catholic, so it's not an issue for me, but what about the issue of empathy in a more general sense? A true psychopath feels absolutely nothing even when they bring you intentional great harm. Let's have a look at Tony Soprano confessing that he at least understands his own nature.
You told me not to get in the game. Why'd you let me do it?
Well, I knew you had this business here, Davy. It's my nature. Frog and the scorpion, you know?
A person with autism might be so blissfully unaware of the situation that they don't even know that you've been hurt. But the distinction is that once they do know, they care just like anybody else. If there are emotional or interpersonal factors behind whatever the injury was, it might even take them extra time to understand the situation, but once they do, the impact is the same to them. So in that sense, there's no alignment on this one. Now, after examining all the traits outlined by Dr. Hare's psychopathy checklist, it's clear that while there may be superficial similarities between psychopathy and autism in certain behaviors, such as difficulties with emotional regulation, the underlying causes are fundamentally different. Psychopathy is characterized by manipulative behavior, lack of empathy, intentional harm, and autism involves challenges with social communication, sensory processing, and emotional understanding. So to circle back to the original question, am I a psychopath? Based on our analysis here, I think it's safe to say the answer is no.
Not a guarantee.
I'm just a guy with autism trying to navigate a world that doesn't always make sense to me and maybe help others understand it a bit better along the way. As noted earlier, however, psychopaths constitute about 1% of the population in general. Since I'm arguing that psychopathy and autism are completely unrelated, that makes them independent variables, which can only lead to one conclusion: that about 1% of autistic people are also psychopaths, which means that you can, in fact, be an autistic psychopath. It seems to me, however, that the most effective psychopaths are highly dependent on their glib charm to navigate through society, conceal their carefully spun webs, and to remain undetected. Those traits seem so contrary to the traits of the spectrum that I'm tempted to conclude that autistic psychopaths are likely not very effective at the psychopath part. We don't have to look very far for a potential counterexample from literature and film. Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men. It's not explicitly revealed whether he has autism or not, but the important point is that he seems to possess many of these spectrum traits that would complicate the life of a great psychopath. Monotone speech, a flat affect, a lack of social understanding, and a rigid adherence to his own set of rules. He does his best to exude that glib charm on demand, but it doesn't come across quite right.
Howdy. What's this about?
Step out of the car, please, sir.
What is that?
I need you to step out of the car, sir.
If you have any interest in matters related to the autism spectrum, please check out the free sample of my book on Amazon, The Non-Visible Part of the Autism Spectrum. It's intended for folks that likely do not have ASD, but who have a number of the traits that put them somewhere on the autism spectrum. It's everything I know now about living a great life on the spectrum that I wish I'd known long ago. And if you found today's episode to be any combination of informative or entertaining, please remember I'm mostly in this for the subs and likes, so I'd be honored if you consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a like before you go today. And if you're already subscribed, thanks. Turn on the bell icon. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.
Do it, Glenn! Do it! Do it!